This evening, Books and Books is very happy to present Ms. Amanda Harris and her new book, Fruits of Eden, David Fairchild and America's Plant Hunters. Ms. Harris was, for many years, a reporter and editor at Newsday. She has also written for the Boston Record American, Herald Traveler, and More, the Journalism Review. And she has family ties to her subject matter in this book, as the daughter of Robin Franklin Harris, who was Marion Fairchild's grandson. Godson, I'm sorry, not grandson, godson. The son-in-law of Alexander Graham Bell and brother-in-law of National Geographic editor Gilbert Grosvenor, David Fairchild shared the spirit of scientific discovery and invention that characterized the late 19th century. And, like his influential relatives, Fairchild introduced revolutionary changes, not in technology or geography, but in the American diet. In this book, Ms. Harris describes how Fairchild believed in the free exchange of food plants among people around the world, and how he convinced the U.S. Department of Agriculture to sponsor overseas explorations to track down and bring back foreign cultivars. Fairchild traveled to remote corners of the globe, searching for fruits, vegetables, and grains that would transform the American diet. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Amanda Harris.
Okay, I think so. Is this all right? Can you hear me? Is everybody all right? Good. I want to thank everybody for inviting me here. I spent a lot of time in the area doing research, either at the University of Miami or the Fairchild Tropical Garden. And at night when I had nothing to do, I used to come here and just hang out in this bookstore because it's such a great store. So it's a real honor to come back here now. So thank you for inviting me. And I also want to thank Gretchen Schmidt and Edible South Florida for providing some Fairchild appropriate snacks. The food is from the Kampong. So indirectly, David Fairchild has cooked the snack for you with Gretchen's help. So I thought I would read briefly from my book, a very brief thing that's fun to read. And then I'll tell you how I got to do this, because everybody always asks me that. But I really would like to answer questions if anybody's interested in this subject. I had no idea the breadth of the material I was going to learn about when I started this, because while it's basically about plant hunting, it's also about plant breeding and eugenics and aviation and politics and the politics versus science and all kinds of really meaty, interesting subjects that are still resonating now. So I just want to, I'll introduce this little passage to explain that, as you may know, David Fairchild first started exploring as the protege of an interesting rich man named Barbara Lathrop, who was from Chicago and came in to more money than he knew what to do with. And he just to circle the globe, steamship run to steamship run, and all by himself for no real mission. And then he met Fairchild, and he decided that they should explore together, because Lathrop had eaten strange fruits and vegetables in other lands that he knew you couldn't get in America. But he needed a botanist to help him out. So the first time they went on a trip together, they wound up, it was an exploratory trip in the current sense of the term. They wound up in the South Seas. So this is 1896. Because one of Lathrop's many travel rules was never to stay long in any one place, the pair had a dizzying itinerary. From Bangkok, they returned to Singapore, then they sailed to Ceylon and Australia. From Auckland, they took a 7-day voyage to Fiji, where they met Thomas Hughes, an English sugar planter who spoke fluent Fijian. Hughes rented a boat and agreed to show them around the archipelago, which was then known as the Cannibal Islands. Quote, "We landed one morning on the island of one of the minor chiefs," Fairchild wrote later. He was a cannibal, of course, as they all were in those days. Hughes led them slowly to the chief's home, a large thatched building raised on rocks from the ground. Quote, "Once inside, we found ourselves on finely woven mats of pandan leaves, covering a layer of ferns so deep it was difficult to walk, Fairchild remembered. The chief, a tall, rather handsome man, was attired for our reception in a white dress shirt, a loincloth into which his shirt tails were loosely tucked, a black four-in-hand tie around his neck. Waving a long fly swatter switch made of the mid-ribs of a coconut frond, he advanced slowly towards us. The chief also wore eyeglasses without lenses. The sugar trader graciously introduced the men. Mr. Hughes explained to him that the President of the United States and his private secretary had come to call, Fairchild wrote. The chief was highly honored and invited us to sit down with him on the floor. The meeting was polite, and the conversation was mostly about food. The American visitors gave their host ice cubes from Hughes' boat, objects he had never seen or tasted. The chief told them about his many cannibal feasts, a ritual that was recently banned. Quote, "Although we might know about this hard, wet stone which seems so hot," the chief told his guests, "we white men had never tasted delicious tidbits of barbecued human being." The chief complained that roast pig, the substitute he was forced to eat, was not as delicious as long pig, which was human meat. Fairchild, now blooming as a gourmet, learned that cannibals traditionally baked people with yams and taro roots in pits filled with banana leaves. He was also told that the thumb and the palm are the tastiest bits of the body. But he didn't try that. Later, at a nearby island, they were introduced to the king of all the cannibal islands, a man of much higher rank, but that meeting was less dramatic. Quote, "Instead of a ceremonial reception such as we had received a few days before, the king was playing cards when we came in and evidently had been drinking heavily," Fairchild said. "He merely turned, gave an unintelligible grunt or two, and went on with his game." So that was the beginning of the American plant explorers. And so anyway, after that, Fairchild sent people all around the globe. Really, pretty much every continent got covered, and they brought back at first actual fruits or vegetables, the actual meat, and then later they started concentrating on seeds and germplasm and other things that they could use to interbreed with American plants. And then he convinced the United States Agriculture Department that they should pay for this instead of Barbara Lathrop, and it became increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly complicated, and really by the end of the First World War, the enthusiasm of the American people and the Agriculture Department had declined. They really didn't see the value of sending people all over the world to collect plants for food. But the department still does do some work, and I don't want to minimize how their interest is. But it wasn't the flamboyant early travel experience and adventure that it was back then. So I heard about him because my grandparents were very good friends of David and Marion Fairchild. As I said in the book, Marion Bell, when she was a teenager, went to a school in Washington, D.C., a girls' school, kind of a progressive girls' school. And my grandmother, Alice Hill, was another student there. So the two of them got to be friends as teenagers, and they stayed friends. And they, instead of going, Marion Bell's father was Alexander Graham Bell, so it was quite a well-known family, and they had a lot of advantages. And her sister was married to Grosvenor, Gilbert Grosvenor, who became the editor. Thanks to Alexander Graham Bell, he became the editor and really the push behind the National Geographic magazine's great success. So when her sister got to be of age, she had a fancy coming out party in Washington. But when Marion Bell came of age, she and my grandmother ran off to New York together to study sculpture in downtown. They wanted to be artists. And So anyway, that was the kind of friendship they had. So after Marion married David Fairchild, and they got the Kampong, and my grandmother and then her husband at that time came to visit. They too wanted to live in Coconut Grove because it was so beautiful. But they had to settle for a very modest cottage around a couple of blocks from the Kampong in 1926, I think. And next door, another woman moved in, and so their neighbor, they became friends with their neighbor, and she was Marjorie DeSonum Douglas. So they were friends because they were neighbors, and then because my grandmother's childhood friend lived around the corner, they got to be friends with Margie Douglas. So it was the beginning, I think, of a very tight and historically important connections, relationships down here that had a lot to do with how Miami's turned out, and certainly saving the Everglades. And so that's how I got into this. Because when my father was a little boy, he was one of the guinea pigs that Fairchild used to use. He was always trying to sneak samples of food to people. You know, he wouldn't necessarily even tell them what it was, but he just told them, "Well, do you like this?" Because he knew if he told them what it was, sometimes they wouldn't even try it. So my father used to, and he was gung-ho. He liked guava, little pieces of guava, which was then completely alien here. It's been a wonderful book. It's been a wonderful experience it's a route into American history at a critical time, I think, without making too much of it. America was a very narrow country in many ways at the beginning of the story. I say that, everything that everybody's plate was brown. It was corn and wheat and pig. And then he brought in mangoes and avocados and figs and wheat that made pasta taste like pasta is supposed to taste, and really not only exposed people to new tastes and a more colorful plate, but also introduced to them the idea that the world is full of wonderful things that we can share with Americans, and America will be a better place. And without making too glib a comparison, a lot of these imported fruits and vegetables were bred into local stuff. It was America. It was a melting pot of people and things from all over the world that has made food better, America better. But at the same time, they had the conflicts that I understand is going on right now about, what about foreign diseases being introduced here? And what about plant pests? And how do you balance science with politics? Fairchild, the best man at the Fairchild's wedding, turned out to be on the side of, we don't want any foreign plants introduced at all. We're a nativist, you could say racist, xenophobic, but he just thought America should just take care of itself and not bring in things from other worlds. And Fairchild was on the exact opposite situation, and it really broke their friendship, I think. But it's a good way to kind of parallel some of the stuff that's going on now. So I hope you all read the book and like it and enjoy live the vicarious living of all these travel adventures I've had. So questions? Anybody has any? Oh, okay.
How did you do the research? How did you get the secondary sources of Fairchild's writing, all the way down to the personal papers and the unpublished manuscripts and all this great stuff?
Yeah, I worked hard. I mean, I used to be an investigative reporter, and so my favorite thing in the whole world are pieces of paper. I never want to interview people. And fortunately, everybody's dead here, so I didn't have to worry about interviewing everybody, right? I could just do it from the records. I started here. I started getting every copy of every Fairchild thing I could find, every book he wrote, every article he wrote. Thank God they invented the internet, because it wasn't really that hard. And then as soon as I felt like I had read I'd gotten my arms around his works, I came down here and I went to the Fairchild Tropical Garden, and I spent hours going through some of the letters, some of the things that are there. There's such a wealth of material there that it's intimidating, because you can't look at every letter he ever wrote to anybody. So I did that a lot, and then I just kept tracking it. Wilson Popenoe, who was really his mentor, all his letters And he wrote letters to his parents. He wrote letters to Fairchild, but then he'd write letters to his parents, and they'd be a little different than what he told his boss, right? And like a lot of these guys, he started to write an autobiography, but he didn't finish it. That's at the Hunt Institute in Pittsburgh, which is another wonderful resource. It's the Hunt Institute for Botanical Illustration, and they have pictures and books and stuff. Joseph Rock, who's one of the other explorers, his letters and stuff are at the Arnold Arboretum in Boston. So I went to Kew Gardens, I went to Chicago, I went to all over Washington. Because of the prominence of Bell and Grosvenor, most of their letters are online and in the manuscript department at the Library of Congress. So it's all there. I mean, you had to be pretty organized, and you got to spend a lot of time, but it was so much fun to find this wealth of information and get little details out of the letters. The primary stuff is where you get the details that make it so much fun. So, and Fairchild liked to write a lot. Sorry, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Could you say if there would be possible to have a list of his favorite plants, let's say 10 favorite plants among the 100,000, introductions?
Well, off the top of my head, I'll do the best I can. Okay. Now, they brought in a lot of material, and a lot of it was, duplicates of the same thing. Like soybeans. There must be hundreds of varieties of soybeans. So, his favorite thing was the mangosteen, which is the fruit on the cover of the book. This is a pile of mangosteens he found in a garden in Pendang, I think. You can't get mangosteens here. The growing conditions aren't good, and the economics of it are a disaster for American farmers. It takes 10 or 15 years to get a crop. And mangoes, he liked mangoes. He liked dried figs, that was his first thing. He loved pasta, hard pasta. And when he went to Italy as a young man, he'd collect as many different shapes as he could, and he'd send them to his guys he worked with back in the agriculture department in Washington. So it was sort of this game they'd play. They'd find a new shape, And I don't know, I don't think I could come up with 10 off the top of my head, but those were definitely his favorites, I think. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I think it's important to mention too that he worked for the USDA Plant Introduction Center in Miami in the late 1800s as it started. And then after World War I, Chapman Field was converted to the Introduction Center, and he was still there. So he had a continuance, and Chapman Field still does what he set out to do, and has to battle politics and locals that want to take over Chapman Field for development.
Still?
I'm on the Friends of Chapman Field committee, and so the politics still goes on. But it's there are centers like this USDA where they're the repository of the gene pool for different tropical species. And sugar cane and cacao and so forth are in Puerto Rico and here.
Yeah. I mean, he came down here with his pal Swingle. Swingle was working down. Walter Swingle was his almost classmate in college, and he too came to work for the agriculture department. This was like being a rocket scientist then. It was so important to have the brightest young people working there. And Swingle came down here, and then in 1898, Fairchild came down here. I don't think he thought he was going to like Florida much before he came, but he just fell in love with it. And then that's why he wound up here, and that's why he stayed around. And he did work at Chapman Field, but as soon as he got an offer to go on another trip, he left, which he did a lot. That's what he did. But I didn't realize it was still in danger. It's too bad. Helene, you had your hand up before.
Yeah, you're talking about Steve not liking some of the fruits. But Fairchild always said, well, if you don't like it, put sugar on it.
Oh, yeah. That's good advice. Did everybody hear that? If you don't like it, I don't think that, if you don't like something, put sugar on it. That's what you Great, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to find out where his house in the woods in Bethesda, is that still there? Is that what is
It's still there. I think it's a like a early education school or something. It's on Grosvenor Lane, I think. You know, as here, her sister bought the house next door. So the Grosvenors and the Fairchilds lived next door to each other there, and as they did down here. I haven't been inside. I've seen pictures. It looks like it's been wildly modified, but I believe it's still the original basic structure.
Is it on that Grosvenor estate, the original?
It's maybe. I mean, I don't think it's an estate anymore. It's in Chevy Chase, right? But I know that the address is Grosvenor Lane or Grosvenor Road.
My sister lives right.
Oh yeah. Oh, well, I'll help you if you want. I'll try to help you pinpoint exactly, because I do have the address written down at home. I don't have it with me.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Just I'll give you my card and you can contact me. Sure. Anybody? Yeah. Yeah.
Did there exist at the time a recognition of the danger of bringing in pests and diseases along with these plants and seeds, fruits? And if there was, did Fairchild share it, and what did they do about it?
Well, there was a recognition. At least by 1898, he was writing about it, which was pretty early. It was one of his first treatise about the mission of his office. Did touch base with that. In fact, Swingle thought about it a lot because he was down here, and so that's how they cooked up this idea, because they wanted to send trained botanists out into the world to find things with the understanding of the etymology and the botany and the mycology, whatever they needed to know, so they could identify problems and and either avoid bringing something in or know how to inspect it properly and stuff. It became a bigger and bigger issue over the next 25 years. I think they would say that had it been done properly, there wouldn't have been any really dangerous introductions. As far as I know, nothing David Fairchild and his people brought in caused a problem like that. The problems at the time were brought in by John Wanamaker, who would go off and buy, decorative apple blossoms to decorate the booths in his store, and they were just totally pest infested. But there's actually a whole lot about this, because Fairchild's best friend was leading the fight to ban all imported fruits and plants, because they're of pests and diseases. At the time, they were trying to ban foreign human beings because they thought they too might contaminate America. So the parallels there, it's not, I don't want to be glib because it's obviously not the same thing, but the politics of the time made more of an issue of it than the science justified, I think. And eventually they stopped. They pretty much stopped. Frank Meyer, who was really the most interesting plant explorer that David Fairchild worked with, he wound up killing himself. And I think one of the reasons was that he realized that the stuff he was going all over the world to find was just going to be destroyed when it got here, because they were trying to get a bill through Congress to crack down on the imports. So yes, it's very much. But I think Fairchild's position was, I don't want these things in here either. I'm not trying to be careless, but don't just cut the contact completely, because then we'll have no new plants, no new trees and flowers. And there's some very eloquent quotes from Fairchild's colleagues, like his boss in Washington, about this is the way the world is. You can't stop nature, but you can try to contain it and make it less dangerous for people. Okay. Hi.
I'm reading a book right now called The Colonial Gardeners. I got it at Fairchild, and it's about Madison and Washington and Adams and who else? There's for the four. Jefferson. Yeah. Have you read that book? It's really.
Who wrote that book? I think I know that book.
I can't remember the author right now. But
I think I read. It's very good.
They transferred plants all the time. They gloried in that, and the theme of the book is that much of the Constitution and the way, just the thoughts of our government, the way it's built, the thoughts are built upon, came out of their gardening and of their theories of gardening, which are beautiful.
Yeah, it's a good book. I know that book.
Yeah.
It says in that book that Thomas Jefferson smuggled rice grains into his pocket from Italy to America, even though he would have faced death had the Italian government caught him doing it. So, yeah, I mean, it is the American way, and it can be risky, but as long as it's managed properly, it's created a great wealth of food and strengthened the economy. But at the time, it was a poisonous issue, I think. One of the things that happened was Alexander Graham Bell, who became very close to Fairchild, he was from Scotland. He was an immigrant, right? And when Fairchild kind of broadened his perspective on his work, he had to write an article, or give a speech, and then it was an article for the National Geographic. And it was at Bell's suggestion that he named his speech "Our Plant Immigrants," to draw that parallel, to get people thinking about, this is a big world. We need to incorporate people and things from the outside world to America. So it is a theme through the book. Did you raise your hand again?
Besides the problem of pathogens being introduced, there's the unknown factor, which happened to befall Fairchild, bringing in plants that then run rampant because having no enemies. Rosary pea is a classic example of a pest we have around here. And the woman's tongue, which came from Egypt, and it spreads like a weed all over.
Because he did bring that in, didn't he?
He brought both of those in.
Yeah.
They aren't full of pathogens, but they outcompete the locals.
He has been blamed for kudzu, but I spent some time on that. It's not his. He wasn't the first person to bring kudzu in. Somebody in Georgia, I think, was, but he did have some in his house in Maryland, and he couldn't get it to go. He couldn't get it to grow. And then they moved to Florida, and the guy who sold his house with complained, your plants are driving me crazy. They're taking over the whole land. They couldn't get the kudzu to be cut back. So, but he wasn't the first one to bring in kudzu. Yeah, he did the best he could. I do think the science was different then. When they started, they didn't know how plants were bred. Swingle and his colleague spent 6 years hand mixing, trial and error, different kinds of citrus fruit to get, oranges that could survive frost down here because they had such a bad frost in 1896. And they came up with comic names, where they take a couple of syllables of the two words and push them together. But one of them was the Mineola Tangelino, which I think was their most successful. It's they call it the honey bell. Somebody put a label on it, but it's a delicious fruit that they mixed, but the hard way before the science caught up with their work. Sure.
Following up on that kudzu thing, several years ago I was doing research on Curtis and Fairchild relationship, and I found Glenn Curtis,
yeah.
And I found in one of Fairchild's notebooks that he had visited Glenn Curtis in Hialeah, and he was so happy to see that the kudzu was doing so well. And then they also both became enthusiastic with papayas at one point in the late 20s. And there was even this whole festival that was held here in Miami to promote papaya. And in the archives, there are all these letters that they sent papayas all over the country, and nobody wanted them. And they arrived rotten, and they couldn't give the stuff away, and they started getting letters, please don't send any more of this stuff.
Well, that happened with mangoes. Nobody would eat a mango. Nobody had anything. His boss wanted nothing to do with mangoes. They thought they tasted like turpentine. And there's a funny little anecdote where somebody, I think it was Hayden, Mrs. Hayden from Palm Beach, whose husband made the so she sent a mango to Fairchild in Washington, and it was beautiful. And Fairchild gave it to his boss, who was this Scottish guy from the Midwest who didn't really care about fruit much. And he said, oh, it has a curious smell. And then he handed it off to somebody, some underling, and the underling took it home and tried to get his kids to eat it, and his kids wouldn't eat it. So they gave it to their gardener, and the gardener didn't want it. And then the gardener gave it to the chickens, and the chickens wouldn't eat it either. So that was the first time a mango got introduced in America. Sure.
Also, in Hawaiian Islands, the mango that they all love is the David Fairchild mango.
Is that what it's called? That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, so it's not like there are different varieties. It's the one he brought.
Yeah.
But he brought it from the Philippines.
Yeah. He brought a lot in. I know they tried a lot. They had to mix them up, find strains that would work here. And it's a big thing, right? This is mango season, peak mango season. I read in the paper today. That's great. That's great. Yeah, good. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Do you have a final count on the number of plants that were introduced by David Fairchild during his lifetime?
Yes, I do. I actually put it in the book, but I don't remember what it is.
An update on that.
Well, every time they brought in, and it wasn't just as explorers. He had contacts all over the world, and he was really very well known. So people would send things in, and people in other countries, gardeners. So a lot of it came from a variety of people. It's not like just those guys. And each time it came in, it was given a number. So what I did was and thanks to the internet, all of these things are online. So you can look at every report of everything anybody sent him from anywhere if you're really into this subject as I am. And so it was, I'm not sure I can put my number on it right here, but it's in here. Most of them failed, most of them, maybe there was something wrong with them when they came. When the gardeners tried to test them in various climates in America, sometimes they took, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they'd be crossbred with something else, and that went. So it's not an easy answer, but I don't think he introduced anything that really was caused a pest. Introduced a pest or a disease that could be documented in any way, because they were careful. They didn't want to do this. They didn't want to cause problems. So I could look the number up, but I don't want to flip through the whole book here. But it's in there. I did.
Buy the book.
Yeah, buy the book. Buy the book. It's in the book.
I would like to say that it made connections for me that I
Now
had
this
never
is Helen
figured out
Pankhurst, who's David Fairchild's granddaughter.
where they fit into his life. And this book is so extremely well documented that the whole family is thrilled to find out all this stuff.
It's a revelation.
It really is. It really is.
Yeah. Well, he had a lot of important friends. He was apparently a very charming and instantly likable, and I don't know, people just wanted to do things for him, like start a tropical garden and name it after him, or take him around the world for 3 years, or work for him, work hard for him. So I feel like I got to know him really well, but I wish I could actually know him a little bit more better than that. But I think the most famous thing was the Meyer lemon. That's a very successful introduction, and that was one where it took. Frank Meyer saw it's a dwarf citrus plant, right? He saw it growing in a doorway, and he was such a brilliant guy. He realized, I've never seen that before. That's a new thing. And so he brought it home, sent it back to Washington. They sent it out to California, and it took years. It took like 8 years before they could even see if it would grow. And then I think once it started growing, they had to figure out how to make it survive in a California climate because of diseases, perhaps. Not because it was diseased, but because they didn't have the natural enemy that would have protected the plant from disease as they would have had in its natural habitat. That's one of the other themes of this book was, how do you fight imported plants and imported pests and diseases? And what you do is you bring in the insect that protects them with them, which is hard to do. It takes, and it sounds easier than it is, but in many cases it did protect American plants. But sometimes it didn't. They brought in, they were not responsible for the chestnut blight, right? The chestnut trees, but this team worked very hard to try to find the natural enemy in China for the chestnut blight, so they could save the American chestnut trees before they all succumbed to this disease. But they weren't able to do it. Who knows why? But so now there are virtually no American chestnut trees left. They had covered 1 billion acres of land on the East Coast, chestnut trees, and they're gone. So, yeah. So,
Where did they find the Meyer lemon?
right outside Peking. He was on foot. Frank Meyer, if you do anything, just read the Frank Meyer part of this book, because he's such an interesting man. He was a genius from Holland who walked all over China as an employee of David Fairchild. And he was by himself. You know, he had a donkey and he had 1,000. He used to carry 1,000 tons of baggage with him everywhere he went, and he couldn't carry botany books, so he had to memorize everything. And he was the kind of guy that if he saw a plant, he would look at it and smell it and touch it, and then it was emblazoned in his memory. And so he'd just go all over the world, and he could file all the plants. So if he saw something new, he'd grab it and bring it back to America. And but it took them several years to figure out how to let Meyer lemons grow and flourish, and they've done it, and they're delicious lemons, as you all know probably. But, any other questions? Yes?
Just wanted to say I've had the privilege of being a volunteer in the archives at Fairchild, and as a retired librarian, I still work part-time, but it just was fascinating to me. I did the scanning and trying to identify the photos, and the very idea that he could, after a hard day of collecting, write in notebooks about that size and with numbers next to the photo on the negatives at the time to connect the dots, so to speak, back to his little notebooks this big. And all this became, I mean, how many photos do you have on your phone? We're never going to be that good. I would go home and think, I really have to get into things here and organize this, And I've done some of it, and then I sort of go, yeah. But it just was fascinating to see that in pre-computer days and everything that goes with that. I mean, that he really had a scientific method of his own, and then what was the beginning of scientific method. And with plant collecting and all that he did, it's just a really fascinating experience.
I think he probably did too much. I think there are hints here and there, and I can't nail it all down, that these people had nervous breakdowns. I mean, they'd come back from it, but they were really, really overworked. And in his case especially, I think he had some very rough times because he was so, so prolific, he wrote so much. But it's great that it's been saved and that you guys are archivized, because it's great to have it. That was the most exciting thing for me. I know that I went into libraries and asked for very obscure things, and some of them came out and they were in boxes, wrapped with not ribbons, but string around them, very carefully preserved. I don't think anybody had ever asked for that stuff in 100 years. It was just sitting there waiting for somebody to come along and be interested enough to read it and use it. And it was really thrilling, and I felt it was such a, they were, I don't know who, dedicated anonymous people did a lot of work so I could come and do this research. So I really paid tribute to them in the book because I really appreciated it. Yep.
You mentioned freezes and oranges and so on, and the dates that you quoted. But I have a question. Did you find connections between Julia Tuttle, who sent oranges to Henry Flagler so that he could come down, bring the railroad and so on, and said oranges grow fine down here? They freeze and so on. Did you find it?
I think I read that story, but I didn't get into it so much. But yeah,
Information to her.
Oh, I don't know. What year was that?
In the 1890s. Yeah.
Maybe. It's possible. If not him, Swingle. Swingle was the citrus expert. He worked for the agriculture department too. And he and a guy named Herbert Weber lived down here for 6 or 8 years doing the trial and error and making the Tangelinos and stuff. It's very possible that they were involved in that because they were pushing, yeah. Oh, that's fine. So, okay, hi, yeah.
Those of us who've been to the Campong know what an exquisite building there is there, but I understand from your book that he wasn't always living the high life when he was there, that economically sometimes he had to do things to make it work because it was such an expensive property.
Well, I don't know if it was the property itself. You know, they paid $25,000 for that property. It was a lot of, it was a lot of money. She had to borrow it from her father, who had to invent the telephone so she could have enough money to get that house. He always said he was land poor. And I think what it was is that they had a house in Washington, and they had this house here, and they were always traveling. And I just think, and I think maybe they lived it up, not lived it up, but they lived very well. If you go to the Library of Congress, you'll find letters from Marion to her mother asking if she could please borrow $15 till next April. The Grosvenors, on the other hand, lived very well. They had, I think they just managed their money differently. You know, I don't think that Gilbert Grosvenor got paid a whole lot more than, as the editor of the National Geographic, than Fairchild did. But they lived in a bigger house and traveled more and stuff. But yeah, no, it wasn't, you know, I think that Alexander Graham Bell, which is another very interesting man, he and his wife spent their money on science. They had a beautiful, apparently, mansion in Nova Scotia that he had to do experiments, and most of the experiments had to do with human flight. He was obsessed with human flight. He called himself a flying machine crank, which is how Glenn Curtis came into the group here, and that's an expensive thing to do, to be an inventor, you know, on that kind of scale. So they didn't give their kids very much money. I mean, you know, Marion never had any income of her own. I mean, she may have had money from her family, but she never worked. She was not of that era, I think. So I know there were in one of the letters or something, he says that he and his wife had to move into one of the outbuildings in the Kampong and rent out the big house because they needed the income. So, you know, which I was surprised. I assumed that they were very comfortable, but they weren't always that comfortable. So, okay, well, thank you very much for all your questions. It was fun to talk to you. Thank you.
All right, folks, so if there are no more questions, then a note to our internet audience watching at home. Still plenty of time for you to get a copy of the book sent to you wherever you are in the United States, free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have Fruits of Eden for sale at the counter over there. Ms. Harris is going to be signing here at the table to the right of the podium. I should also mention that we still have a delicious reception back there, courtesy of Edible South Florida Magazine. So have some treats, buy a book, get it signed, and let's please give another hand to Amanda Harris. Thanks very much.